Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Alyssa Thorner, and on behalf of the Johns Hopkins Breast Cancer Program, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar tonight, Mindfulness and Meditation. We've got a great speaker for you this evening. Dr. Gould is a clinical psychologist and an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. She's also serves as the director of the Mindfulness Program at Johns Hopkins, and she's the associate director of the Johns Hopkins Bayview Medical Center Anxiety Disorder Clinic. In addition to treating patients with anxiety and depression, one of Dr. Gould's primary areas of interest is teaching mindfulness-based stress reduction, or MBSR, and other mindfulness programs to patients, faculty, and staff here at Johns Hopkins. She's led numerous clinical and professional MBSR groups, and with an MBSR interventionist for a recent randomized clinical controlled trial for patients with migraines. Dr. Gould was involved with a systematic review on a meta-analysis entitled Meditation Programs for Psychological Stress and Well-Being that was published in JAMA Internal Medicine. So we really have quite the expert for you here this evening. I'd like to welcome you again. Just a few housekeeping things to go over before we get started. For most of you, your cameras are off, but if your cameras are not off, I'd like to ask you to please turn your cameras off so that way it's not a distraction for other people who are going through Dr. Gould's presentation. Additionally, you'll see on the chat feature that should be at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions, please feel free to message me. Your questions will come to me. We'll try to get to as many questions at the end of the presentation for Dr. Gould as possible. Again, I'd like to thank you for joining us. And Dr. Gould, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to you right now.
Thank you so much, Alyssa, and thank you for taking time out of your evening to be here. It's really a pleasure to spend some time talking to you about mindfulness. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then you can see my slides. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that now. So I'm hoping to speak to you a little bit about what mindfulness is this evening, some of the science and research behind it, and then give you some tools that you can begin to use in your daily life, and finally guide you through a brief practice. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers, as Alyssa mentioned. So to begin, let's talk for a moment about the stress response. So we're no strangers to the stress response, and especially during this pandemic, many of us have noticed our stress responses increasing. The human stress response, or the fight or flight response, is a beautiful system that's in place to protect us during times of danger. So when we're confronted with a threat, our body is prepared to fight, flee, or freeze in that moment. The issue nowadays is that the system turns on much more frequently than it was designed to turn on. And we can even turn the system on just by thinking about a perceived threat. So you might be thinking about, well, what's going to happen with COVID, or, fill in the blank, and we can turn on the stress response. And while the stress response is vital to our survival, it's not designed to be turned on quite as frequently as we turn it on. And so today I'm hoping to be able to talk to you a little bit about ways we can begin to turn off the stress response. So chronic stress, so turning on that system over and over and over, or having that system on all the time, is associated with physical and psychological health issues. So it's not that it's you're stressed and that it's going to lead to these problems. It's a very complex interaction, but we know that when we're chronically stressed, we feel more anxious, depressed, irritable. We might not focus as well. But then also things I've listed here have been associated with chronic stress. So that's the bad news. We'll get it all out of the way. And the rest of my talk will focus on things you can do to curtail this stress response. Hopefully you have things to engage in already as a means of stress reduction. So some people like to go out in nature, go for a walk, call a friend. And of course, we're limited to some degree because of COVID, but I'm hoping that you're still able to tap into some of your resources, even if you have to be creative, hobbies or crafts, to continue to work on stress reduction. I'd like to add one more tool to your toolbox today, and that is the tool of mindfulness. So, what is mindfulness? We hear this term very frequently nowadays. You know, if you go to the grocery store, you see it on the cover of magazines. It's paying attention to the present moment on purpose without judgment. So we're intentionally bringing our attention to the present moment, but not judging our experience as good or bad, but just noting our experience and being curious about it. Another way to think about it is that when you're mindful, you're present for your life as this individual here notes, as you not as you hoped it would be or expected it to be, or seeing more or less of what is here, not with the judgments that lead us to a conditioned reaction, but just being here with your experience, your internal and external experience, exactly as it unfolds moment to moment to moment. And, you know, these are high aspirations. Most of us are not mindful, and most of us certainly aren't mindful all the time. So this is challenging, and this is a muscle that needs to be built. But I'm going to talk to you about how to set the foundations for this. So the opposite of being mindful is being on autopilot. So you can take a moment to think about times when you're most likely to be on autopilot. Those might be, many people, of course, say driving. We're perhaps driving less these days. Maybe eating, talking to others. We can be, whoa, that was funny. I don't know what just happened, but we can be um, on autopilot for most of our day and not even be aware. And so, what's the problem with being on autopilot? So, if it's working for you, nothing. So if you don't mind being on autopilot, that's okay. Um, but most of us turn to some of these practices because we don't want to be in that constant state. And one issue is that we miss out on life. We miss out on the pleasant aspects of life. And the other is that we don't build a resilience to be with the challenging aspects of life when we're not mindful. And so part of mindfulness is experiencing the pleasure and seeing the beauty in life, even during difficult times. And the other aspect is turning towards the difficulties and learning how to work with those in kind of specific ways so that you build resilience to being with the challenges of life that we all experience in some form as well. So, what gets in the way of our mindfulness? I've listed some examples here. So, thinking, the fact that we're able to think, as I mentioned, automatically can take us away from the present moment. So we make to-do lists, we worry, we have stories that we make up in our minds about what could or couldn't happen in a situation. No other animals do that. So no other animals are sitting at home worrying about what's going to happen with COVID or X, Y, or Z. They're very mindful. They're in the present moment, and they basically react to each moment, moment by moment. And we don't do that. And that's certainly a contribution to our stress, and also one way that we're not in the present moment. Multitasking, so we tend to think we're amazing multitaskers, but what the research shows is that we're not actually good multitaskers, that our attention is divided. We don't do either of the tasks as well, and we don't enjoy the tasks that we're doing as much when we're multitasking. And what we know is that we tend to be we tend to be happiest when we are fully engaged in what we're doing. And then, of course, our cell phones take us away from the present moment. So that instant you pick up your phone and you get a text or you hop onto Facebook, you're no longer in the present moment. And it's not that you shouldn't do those things, and it's not that you shouldn't plan for the future. You certainly should. It's that you just, when you do those activities, note that you're engaged in those activities as opposed to kind of being sucked into this future or past world. So when we're building an awareness of our experiences and what we're engaged in. So when can we practice mindfulness? In theory, in every moment, we can be mindful. As I mentioned, we're not, but we have the opportunity to build the muscle of mindfulness in every moment. So there are many people, when they think of mindfulness or mindfulness meditation, you envision someone sitting, focusing on their breath, sitting in a chair or sitting on the floor, focusing on your breath. And that is a formal meditation practice where you bring your attention to some aspect of the present moment over and over again. And we're going to do that this evening just so you can get a sense if you've never used a meditation before. The other part is what we call informal mindfulness, and that's noticing when you're on autopilot any moment of the day. Even in this moment, your mind might be wandering or thoughts might be elsewhere, and returning back to the present, returning back to your senses, returning back to what you're experiencing in this particular moment. And both of these things, formal and informal mindfulness, are important to begin to build that muscle of mindfulness. Just some myths about mindfulness. I have to empty my mind of thoughts. So many people say, "Oh, I can't do that meditation stuff. My mind is racing. I have to empty my mind of thoughts." And the nice thing about mindfulness is you don't have to change your experience at all. So the idea is not to empty your mind of thoughts or to even have peaceful thoughts. The idea is to be aware of your thoughts. So if you notice that your mind is racing, that is mindfulness. You don't have to change it. It just turns out that by bringing attention to some of our experiences, like a racing mind, over time it does tend to settle just by becoming aware of it. I should feel relaxed afterwards. So mindfulness is different than relaxation. Um, if you do something relaxing, such as taking a warm bath or um, uh, getting a massage, whatever you equate to a relaxing activity, the intention is that you'll feel relaxed after you go into it with that intention. However, with mindfulness, we are turning towards experiences, even if they're uncomfortable, and you may or may not feel relaxed as a result. So we may turn towards physical sensations in the body or thoughts that we're having, and we're allowing some space for them and turning towards them. So in the moment, you may or may not feel wonderful or relaxed. It turns out over the long term, though, if we can turn towards our experiences and be with them, a byproduct of that does tend to be relaxation, as opposed to the resistance we're often experiencing when we're having an experience that we don't like. I'm too busy to practice. I'll be less productive if I'm focused on the present. These are myths. What the research shows is that if you can take the time to practice, even a few minutes a day, that you're actually more productive and you enjoy the tasks you're engaged in to a greater degree. So why practice? So I've mentioned some tidbits, reasons that practicing mindfulness can improve your daily life. But let's dig a little bit deeper into some of the science behind this. Several years ago, a large group of us at Hopkins got together and basically reviewed every study that was ever done on meditation. And we screened almost 19,000 studies and narrowed it down to the most robust trials. So the strongest, well done studies, randomized controlled trials that are the gold standard of research. And within these 47 trials, we noticed that there was the strongest evidence for improvements in anxiety, depression, and pain across clinical and non-clinical populations. It didn't mean that meditation wasn't helpful for other domains. It just was at this point when we did this review that there were a lot of gaps in the research and the quality of the studies weren't strong enough. And so the research continues to grow, and this is a very, very burgeoning area of research. And what we know, again, what continues is that, yes, there is significant improvement in stress, anxiety, depression following mindfulness practices. And I'll talk a little bit about what kind of the programs that are most studied entail. Um, we see improved, but we see also, I've highlighted in yellow those aspects that show up consistently in the research, but there's also all these other areas that we know can be positively impacted with meditation, and we're still continuing to learn more about them. So improvements in memory, improvements in changes in structures, even in changes in your brain structure and function, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. Um, it's fascinating that mindfulness can really have a profound impact on pain, severity, the decreased disability associated with pain, and increased pain acceptance. And this is really puzzling to people that we're in mindfulness practices, we turn towards the pain instead of trying to push it away or distract ourselves. We recognize it and make space for it. And with these practices over the course of of various courses, uh, we know that the pain actually begins to decrease. And then cardiovascular, immune, digestive, even metabolic shifts in the positive direction with mindfulness practices. I run this course for faculty and staff at Hopkins, and and this is just unpublished data, but we see significant decreases in burnout and stress, and improvements in mindfulness and work engagement, which is consistent with other literature. So let's take a moment and talk about the brain. In red, I've highlighted the parts of the brain that are involved in meditation. And the names of these regions aren't so important, but I'll just briefly touch on them. So starting on the right, we have the insula, which is involved in self-awareness and perception. And then going up, it's pointing to the cingulate cortex involved in emotional regulation. The frontal lobe, so this is a brain facing, it's as if the individual is their eyes are facing to the left of my screen, and we look through the middle of their brain. We slice it in half. So the executive functions in the frontal lobe are the higher order thinking, the parts of our brain that allow us to reason, think analytically, that make us smarter than all the other animals. And then the amygdala, which is involved in that fight or flight response and emotional processing. So that's the part of the brain that turns on when we are confronted with an actual or a perceived threat. So what we know is that from previous studies, such as this one, people have compared the brains of long-term meditators to non-meditators. And they imaged these individuals' brains and found that their brains were actually different in structure and function. So in this particular study, what they found were that the long-term meditators had greater volume in the prefrontal cortex and in the insula. So remember, the prefrontal cortex involved in higher order thinking, the insula involved in emotional processing. And so we know that these things, the brains of these individuals that dedicate their lives to these practices are actually different. But most of us aren't going to leave, you're not going to leave this talk and become a monk or a nun or dedicate your life to these practices. And so more recent studies have shown promising uh, findings and changes in the brain similar to long-term meditators, even after 8 weeks of an intensive course. This review article basically found that 8 weeks after 8 weeks of the mindfulness-based stress reduction course, we see changes in the brain similar to some of the long-term meditation changes. Um, and those changes are what? In this review, they found that there was increased activity, connectivity, and in volume in the prefrontal, sorry, in increased activity and connectivity in the prefrontal cortex. That's the part again involved in executive functioning. Increased activity and even increased volume, some studies found in the hippocampus, which is involved in memory formation. And then in the areas of self-awareness and perception, emotional regulation, again, we see increased activity, connectivity, or volume. And then the amygdala, so that part of the brain that turns on when we are stressed, we see decreased activity and earlier deactivation to emotional stimuli for individuals who've taken this course. So what that means is that when you are confronted with a stressor, you are running late to a meeting, you just got news that the COVID vaccine will come out later than expected, whatever turns on your stress response. With mindfulness practices, when there's not an actual threat, we're able to turn off those parts of the brain more readily, so turn down the stress response. The mindfulness-based stress reduction course is an 8-week program. It's one that I teach at Johns Hopkins for patients as well as for faculty and staff separately. And in it, we meet once a week for 2.5 hours and then a full day silent retreat. Currently trying to figure out what to do with the next course, whether the full course would be online or we'll do some modifications because it is a long time to be on the computer. And the course, one of the beautiful aspects of the course is kind of the cohesion that develops with other individuals, which you can't quite capture in an online uh, way, but so to be continued in terms of what the next course will look like. And you're welcome to send me an email or uh, um, shoot me a message in the chat if the course is something that you'd be interested in taking sometime in the future. But it's during the 8-week course, we learn different meditation practices, and then there's also home practices. So it's quite a time commitment. We're meeting 2.5 hours a week, and then building up to, by the end of the course, 40 minutes of home practice. But it's a wonderful course if you ever have the opportunity to take it, that gives you the tools in a very structured way to apply the mindfulness techniques. And the course was developed by someone named Jon Kabat-Zinn in the 70s. And it was initially developed for individuals with pain, but now, as I mentioned, has been applied to a variety of psychological and medical populations with great benefit for many of those groups. And so if you're looking just to get your feet wet and see what the course is about, you can always get a book by him, Jon Kabat-Zinn, and the book that's based on that program is called Full Catastrophe Living. So how can you begin to incorporate mindfulness into your day? So at any point during the day, you can just pause and take 3 deep breaths. Okay, so these are ways where you can recenter yourself, ground yourself back into the present moment. They're simple tools that you can use to remind yourself that, oh, I can come back to this moment, wherever the mind tends to go. So pause, take 3 breaths a few times during the day whenever you can remember. Bring attention to your senses. So our senses always reside in the present moment. So at any point, you can go outside and listen to the birds. You can notice what your skin is coming into contact with temperatures against the skin, what you're seeing, what you're smelling, and you can come back to the present moment. Pause before transitioning to a new task. So you can pause before you even move to a new room and just take a few deep breaths, allow whatever was in that space to kind of fade as you move into the next task or space. Pause before picking up your phone. I don't know how many times we pick up our phone during the day, but it's a high number. And it's usually quite automatic. And we're walking and we're checking text messages, or we're just scrolling through Facebook, or whatever it may be. Take a moment and pause. And sometimes you might just want to ask yourself the question of whether you even need to pick up your phone in that moment. The phone, while it's a wonderful way to connect, it can also be a great source of stress. So just, be mindful of when you're using your phone. Label your emotion. So as psychologists, we have a saying, if you can name it, you can tame it. So if you can name what you're feeling, I'm feeling angry, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling frustrated or irritable or happy, whatever it is, if you can name that emotion, it begins to de-intensify um, the that the experience. So you can just note the emotion in a word or two, make some room for it, and then when you feel ready, shift to an activity. Catch yourself when you're on autopilot. So I think these are all ways that above that that you can catch yourself when you're on autopilot and return back to the present moment. And of course, because this isn't our natural way of being, having something to remind you. So maybe um, every time your phone rings, or dings from a text message, you take a few deep breaths. There's some way to begin to incorporate these practices. If you do decide that you'd like to incorporate some of the formal practices, I'm going to give you some resources for those later on. You can also think about how to integrate them into your day. So maybe when you wake up, you want to do something for 5 minutes, or some people prefer to do it midday. Some people may prefer to do it in the evening, but again, some way to remind yourself and begin to hold you accountable for some of these practices. We can eat mindfully. I'm not a mindful eater. This is still an area of growth for me that I need to practice. But perhaps during this pandemic, one thing that we can begin to do is eat a little more mindfully. It's challenging as uh, food is closer by for many of us if you're at home. But think about if you can take one meal, one snack this week, and just by yourself, without a phone, without discussions with other people, without the newspaper or your computer, sit down with your meal, maybe use all of your senses to see the colors, smell, um, put your fork down between bites and just focus on the bite at hand, and also just have gratitude for all of the hands that were involved in bringing this food to your plate on a particular day. So again, we can bring mindfulness to every activity of our days. The meal that we just kind of might shovel in our mouth, or forget about, we can actually slow down and savor, and that can be a moment of pleasure throughout our day. This is my favorite tool during times of distress, is to drop the story. So what does that mean? When we're confronted with a stressful event, our mind can really attach catastrophe to those stressful events. So we're running late for a meeting, and that's stressful enough. And then all of the stories, the add-on thoughts that take us away from that. Oh gosh, what's going to happen if I'm late for this meeting? I'm late for everything. Gosh, why can't I just get this one thing right? Wherever your mind tends to go. So state the facts of an event when you're in a stressful situation. I'm running late for a meeting. Notice those thoughts that take you away from just the facts and just come back to the facts. And if you practice this frequently enough, you begin to notice how the mind really has a mind of its own and can really take you away from an already stressful situation and make it so much worse. And we have the opportunity to return back to this moment. Another way to bring mindfulness to daily life is through mindful communication. So when we these days we may have some opportunities to communicate more with people. That can be a good or a bad thing for some of us, but when we're communicating mindfully, we can really hear what's being said. We can listen to our intuition and make better choices. And so we're pulling ourselves out of that reactive mode of hearing something and reacting to it immediately, which doesn't always fare well for our interactions. And we can be assertive as opposed to passive aggressive or passive aggressive. So assertive communication is where you're able to express your needs in a calm and respectful way, respectful of yourself, respectful of the other person, as opposed to these other forms of communications that are actually stressed forms of communication. Being aggressive, being passive is surprisingly a stressed form of communication, and passive aggressive. So how can we communicate mindfully? So if you're the listener, it's hard to see, but on the left-hand column, before you just take a moment to pause when you're listening. Let what you hear sink in. Don't interrupt, and acknowledge with nodding or some nonverbal cues that you're listening. Many times as listeners, we are already thinking about what we're going to say or judging the other person or judging ourselves. But here we're really just focusing on what this person is saying and hearing what they're saying as opposed to what we think they're saying, as opposed to looking at something through our filtered lenses. As the speaker, you can pause, make your speech truthful and useful, and don't fill in the silence. So some of those moments of silence are uncomfortable and awkward sometimes, but can be very, very powerful if we can begin to tolerate them and can prevent us from filling in gaps with unuseful information. I was at a retreat several years ago, and the meditation teacher, her name was Mary Aubrey, spoke to us about mindful communication and this acronym King Tut. And what she said was, make your speech kind, truthful, useful, and timely. And this really sticks with me, especially when I'm in a stressful situation for communicating, and I will say to myself, is my speech going to be kind? Is it going to be truthful? Is it useful? Do I even need to say it? And even if all those things are true, is this the right time to say it? And I've noticed that by practicing this and kind of having this acronym in my mind, I've prevented myself from having a reaction to a stressful communication that I later regret. So where to begin if you're interested in kind of practicing mindfulness? You can Google mindfulness meditation and thousands of things will come up, and that's certainly one way to go. UCLA and UCSD both have mindfulness centers, and they have listed free guided meditations, which are nice places to start. Many people love apps. These are some of the most common ones. I don't have a preference for one over another, but Calm is a popular one. Insight Timer has hundreds, if not thousands, of free meditation. Headspace is similar to Calm. It's easier to use guided meditation practices initially, but actually always. It helps keep us focused. So those are some places to begin. I run mindfulness 30-minute sessions daily. I will begin them again on Monday, this coming Monday. Currently, a couple of colleagues are running them running some of my pre-recorded sessions just because I'm out of town. But on Monday, I'll resume doing them live, and you're more than welcome to join those. They're 30 minutes, and each time we do a different meditation, sometimes focusing on the breath, sometimes focusing on our senses, doing a body scan, a variety of different things. So that's my last slide. So what I was hoping to do for the next 10 to 12 minutes or so is to guide you through a meditation practice before we end for questions and answers. So let me just exit the screen sharing for a moment. Okay. So if you'd like to participate here, you can just find a comfortable position for yourself, one in which you feel awake and alert, but also comfortable. So these practices can make you a little drowsy at times. And so they can be wonderful practices to do before bed if you'd like, if you need help sleeping. They can be great sleep aids. But to build that muscle of mindfulness that I was speaking about, you do, need to be awake. So I'd encourage you to do some of these practices during the daytime, but if you need something to help for sleep, then certainly practice them during sleep as well. If you're doing it during the daytime, or right now with me, find a position where you feel like you are awake, and if you can close your eyes, but if need be, if you think you'll get too sleepy, just keep them open, have a soft, unfocused gaze in front of you. You can be seated in a chair, and if so, having an upright spine, not one that's stiff, but also not slouching back into your chair. And let's begin by taking a few deep breaths together. So taking a deep breath in and a long, slow exhalation. And then when you feel ready, drawing the next breath in and a long, slow exhalation. And one more time. Deep breath in, long, slow exhalation. And as you exhale, let go and settle into this moment. Go ahead and bring your attention back to your normal rhythm. Bring your breath, rather, back to your normal rhythm. Just allowing your breath to resume its natural state. And let's take a moment to notice sounds around us. Allowing your breath to fade into the background a little as you notice sounds close by and farther away. Noticing the spaces between the sounds. Not judging the sounds as good or bad, but we're just being open and curious about the sounds. By now, you've probably noticed that the mind wanders. The mind doesn't stay on the breath or sounds, even though we want it to. And that's perfectly normal, perfectly expected. Each time you notice the mind has wandered, just gently bring it back to whatever we're focusing on and begin again. That's the heart of the practice, noticing and beginning again. Let's shift our attention again to sensations in the body. So, first, taking a moment to note to yourself how you're feeling physically in this moment. And there's no one way to feel. Maybe you're feeling tired or energized, tense or relaxed, comfortable or uncomfortable. It doesn't matter. We're just noting it. If there are specific areas of tightness or tension, note those. Describe it in a word or two: tight, tense, pain, discomfort. And on the next out breath, just directing your breath to those regions or one of those regions and softening. Just softening. So we've checked in briefly with sounds and our breath, with sensations in our body. Let's also check in with our emotions, taking a moment to ask yourself, how am I feeling right now? Being okay with whatever the answer is. Stressed, worried, irritable, peaceful. It doesn't matter. We're just noting our emotions. And taking a moment to be here exactly as you are, exactly as you're meant to be in this one particular moment. And when you feel ready, returning your attention back to your breath. And let's notice the breath for a few moments. Breathing in, noticing that you're breathing in, and breathing out, noticing that you're breathing out. You can even rest your attention somewhere along the breath cycle that feels strongest to you. Perhaps noticing the tip of the nostrils, the cool air as you inhale, the slightly warmer air as you exhale, or the back of the throat, or the rising and falling of the belly. with the lightest of touches resting your attention on a part of the breath cycle, noticing when the mind wanders, and with a kind and friendly touch, returning and beginning again. Just this moment, just this one breath. Just this moment, and just this one breath. Breathing in, noticing that you're breathing in. Breathing out, noticing that you're breathing out. And before we end for today, this portion of our time together, I just wanted to read to you this poem that resonates with me. It's called Allow by Donna Faulds. There is no controlling life. Try corralling a lightning bolt containing a tornado. Dam a stream and it will create a new channel. Resist and the tide will sweep you off your feet. Allow and grace will carry you to higher ground. The only safety lies in letting it all in. The wild and the weak, fear, fantasies, failures, and success. When loss rips off the doors of the heart, or sadness veils your vision with despair, practice becomes simply bearing the truth. In the choice to let go of your known way of being, the whole world is revealed to your new eyes. So when you feel ready, you can open your eyes, take a moment to stretch out.
Dr. Gold, that was wonderful. Thank you very much. I think that poem definitely can resonate with a lot of us, given all the things we're all dealing with right now. So I want to thank you for a wonderful presentation, and I definitely feel more grounded after that short meditation. So I'm going to open it up for questions right now. Yeah, I'll just start by saying Dr. Gold started doing, maybe she's been doing it all along, but I know several people in our department in the breast cancer program found some of these meditation sessions that you started, I guess, during COVID, and how wonderful, how helpful they were. And I just, again, want to sort of make a mention of the idea that I think we'd all like to be more evolved people that could spend a lot of our days meditating, but even some things are better than nothing. And so these 30-minute sessions, I think for a lot of us really helped us and are helping us cope with all the things that are going on in our life. So I wanted to, again, thank you for that. And, wanted to again talk a little bit about some of the things that at least I heard you say that I think resonated with me. And the first was, it was interesting when you were talking about the divided attention. As soon as you started talking about that, I got a text from somebody. It was a patient, but I started returning the text and thinking I could do this sort of multitasking thing. And so it reminded me again that I wasn't present in either thing that I was doing. So the idea of trying to be more present and the way of being more productive, I think is really helpful. And I think at least what I sort of heard a common theme through a lot of your presentation with this idea of sort of, again, being in the moment and pausing. I like what you were saying about entering into a room, pausing when you put a fork down. We joke a lot in my family about who can get the biggest spoon to shovel the food in fast enough to sort of get on to the next thing. So, definitely some really important takeaway message about, again, being in the moment, being an active listener, being present. We're getting a lot of questions. Again, want to remind people to please use the chat feature. I'm going to go ahead and start, if that's okay with you, Dr. Cole, with some of the questions that we're getting. One of the questions we're hearing is about, yeah, I just mentioned the 30-minute piece, and then I know you had mentioned sort of the silent retreat. And does it have to be 30 minutes? Or I guess we're getting some questions about, is some better than nothing? Can you take 5 minutes and sort of become grounded?
Yes, absolutely. The programs that have been studied have used those durations, many of them, but 1 minute is better than nothing. 5 minutes is fantastic. So there's no magic number, but you may notice that it takes some time to settle in, some time to begin to do the practices, and you may need a little bit more time. But start with a minute a day. If you can do that, then you're not only 1 minute more mindful, but it begins to seep into different parts of your life. But you can think of it as going to the gym, that you don't go one time for 5 minutes and then forever you're in shape. I mean, don't I wish? But you have to make it a habit. So whatever you need to do to make it a habit is what you should aim for. So maybe that's 5 minutes every day, and then maybe longer sessions when you have time, or building up to 20 minutes a day. But absolutely, some is better than none.
I think that's a great comparison with the gym, and I often tell patients, especially when patients are just out of treatment, even walking to the mailbox is better than not. And even if you're just literally walking 10 steps, it's 10 less steps than you would have taken otherwise. Starting small, and sometimes that doesn't feel so overwhelming. Just and then building on it as sort of as you that muscle memory, if you will.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Wonderful. So another question that we're getting is when patients are going through treatment, and again, right now it's particularly stressful and you don't necessarily have that caregiver with you when you're in treatment, are there things that you would recommend, specific programs or certain meditations if you're sitting there for a period of time and things are particularly stressful while you're going through treatment?
Hmm. Yeah. So a couple of things. I think using some form of guided practice during those moments. So when we are under distress, it's pretty challenging to draw on some of our resources all of a sudden and begin to use them. So I'd recommend using something guided.
Mhm.
Um, how do we work with whether it's physical or emotional discomfort is a big question, and not one that I can say do this and it'll be fine. I think that what I would recommend, if I had to really simplify it, would be to note the discomfort. Don't try to push it away, but don't immerse yourself in it if it's feeling overwhelming, whether it's physical or psychological pain. So, for example, say you're going under treatment and you're feeling nauseous, for example, note the nausea.
Mm.
This is where it is. This is what it feels like, and then shift your attention to something more pleasant. So we don't want to push it away, but we also, when we're really distressed, also don't need to torture ourselves.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. I heard you use the word guided, and we're getting a question specifically about guided imagery and how that might be different than meditation. And
Yeah.
if you could also speak to a little bit about, we're getting a question about how biofeedback may be similar to meditation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So guided imagery is where you close your eyes and imagine a peaceful place, usually. So you're at a beach, and all of the experiences, senses, sounds, smells, whatever brings you that sense of peace. So it's different than meditation in that you're envisioning yourself in a different place. However, it can be wonderfully relaxing. So you experiment with these different things. I'm a fan of all of them, and so I don't think you need to pick one or the other. Sometimes you can use the guided imagery. Sometimes you can use the meditation practices. Biofeedback is a tool that's used to where we are. using the physiological measurements, I guess, so to speak, of our body or experiences, and we try to shift them as we get feedback about them. For example, you might notice that often you're connected to sensors initially as you're learning this, but you're getting some sort of feedback about your heart rate, and your heart rate is increasing, and you're noticing that based on your Apple Watch or whatever, and you do some deep breathing to with that feedback you've gotten. So there's the bio part, the biology of us, and then the feedback part, that information you're getting, and you try to shift that experience by doing some sort of deep breathing, for example, in that point. So you could use some meditation practices to change some of those things, but that would be a longer term goal. That with the
Got it.
meditation in the moment, you might not notice a shift.
Got it. That makes sense. We have a question. So someone wrote in that she fell asleep during the meditation, and I hear this a lot, that you get so relaxed, you sort of get into that zone and sort of go past that point. Is that something that you hear, and does that sort of defeat the purpose, or is that sort of the goal?
Yeah, yeah, it's a good question. So, yeah, I totally can relate to that. Even I sometimes start falling asleep when I'm leading the meditation. So it is very, very common. The goal is to stay awake. However, you may find that it's a moment where you can fall asleep, and you want to take a little nap, no problem, or using it at bedtime, as I mentioned, that's perfectly fine. So you don't need to beat yourself up for falling asleep. The intention to stay awake is because that's when over time we see the changes in the brain when we stay awake and we do these practices while we're alert and awake. But there's nothing quote unquote wrong with falling asleep. Just kind of be aware of your intention.
Got it. And actually, you bring up a good point that just made me think. I definitely get a lot of questions from patients about trouble with falling asleep or staying asleep, just with life, and then some of the treatment issues that come with sleep disturbances. Are there specific meditations or specific apps or things that you would recommend if you're, having trouble getting to sleep, or waking up in the middle of the night at 3 o'clock in the morning and can't get back to sleep?
Yeah, yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So yes, any meditation that you find relaxing could work, but there's one that I think is really good for that purpose, and it's called the body scan, where you systematically bring attention to different sensations in the body, starting from the toes, working all the way up to the crown of your head, and that on that UCLA website, or if you just Google body scan meditation, that one of those will come up. And I think that's a really nice meditation for either when you're trying to go to sleep and the mind starts racing, or in the middle of the night when you have trouble getting back to sleep.
So we're getting very close to time, but I have one final question that we're getting, and it's being asked a few different ways in the chat feature. For people that are starting out, or even for people that have been meditating for a while, is it pretty common for you to have those racing thoughts, or sort of having your mind wander? And are there any tricks that you can recommend, to sort of try to stay present and in that moment?
Mhm. Yes, yes, it's very common to have the racing mind, even for experienced practitioners. It's not a problem that your mind races or that you're thinking. That comes with the territory of being human.
Mhm.
So what we're doing with the mindfulness is just noticing our experience. Oh, there's the racing mind. How interesting. Let me come back to my breath. Or
Mhm.
there's the racing mind. How interesting. Let me follow and see where it goes, and then come back to my breath. And so there's permission here to explore and not make your experience wrong. So when we make our experience wrong, that's when we start to really get caught in this vicious cycle of negativity. But if you say, this is just my experience in this moment, and it's not supposed to be a particular way. In fact, it's exactly as it's supposed to be right now. Then we give ourselves permission to just be curious about our experience as opposed to feeling a need to change it.
I like that. So sort of a more positive spin on sort of acknowledging what's happening, but then trying to go back to the breath rather than being in a judgmental state. What a really great
Exactly.
suggestion. So we're about getting really close at a time. Dr. Gould, I've always said I could talk to you forever, and your meditations are just so relaxing. I know that I feel much more relaxed, and I'm sure I'll sleep better tonight. So I want to thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. We have gotten several questions about people that are interested in possibly joining one of your Zoom links, or potentially looking at some of the apps that you recommended. Would it be possible to get a copy of your slides that I could send out to
Oh, I'm
just
happy to share those, yes.
wonderful. Thank you so much. So if you wouldn't mind sending them to me, then I'll send them out to the group. And for those of you who are listening tonight, we are recording this session. So in the next week or so, you'll be getting an email from me with the recorded link that you can go back and watch if you've missed anything or want to hear Dr. Gold's presentation again. You'll also be getting an email from me probably tomorrow, wanting to know how we did. There's a quick survey link that I'll be sending out. If you could take less than a minute and just fill that out. Again, that'll help us plan for future programming and other topics, and how we can improve what we're doing. I'd like to thank everybody tonight for joining us. Dr. Gold, again, thank you for a wonderful evening. I know you've definitely made my night better, and I'm sure so many other people's as well. So thank you again, and I hope everybody has a great evening.
Thank you
Thank
so much. It was lovely to be here with
thank
everyone.
you. Take care.
All right,
Bye-bye.
bye.